What if the man who could have ended the war faster, pushed deeper into Europe, and potentially reshaped the entire Cold War balance of power was sidelined not by the enemy, but by his own side? In the autumn of 1945, as the dust of World War II began to settle and the ruins of Nazi Germany smoldered under Allied occupation, one of the most decorated and feared battlefield commanders in American history found himself stripped of meaningful command, humiliated in the press, and fighting not against the Wehrmacht but against the political machinery of Washington. General George S. Patton, Jr., the man who had driven the Third Army across France faster than any force in modern military history, who had relieved the siege of Bastogne in December 1944 just when the Battle of the Bulge threatened to unravel everything, now sat in Bavaria commanding a paper army with no real mission. And it was Dwight D. Eisenhower, his old friend, his superior, and in many ways his conscience, who found himself torn between loyalty to a brilliant but combustible soldier and the enormous political pressures bearing down from President Harry S. Truman in Washington and from allies across the Atlantic. This is the story of that tension, that impossible moment, and the men at the center of it. If this kind of deep historical storytelling moves you, please subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button so more people can find this content, share this video with someone who loves history and real stories of leadership under pressure, and drop a comment below telling us something you already know about Patton, or something you're about to learn for the first time. The story truly begins not in 1945 but years earlier, when Patton and Eisenhower first forged their complicated bond during the interwar years, training together at Camp Meade, Maryland, in the early 1920s, debating tank warfare doctrine when most of the Army establishment still thought cavalry and horses were the future of combat. Patton, born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, into a family steeped in military tradition, had graduated from West Point in 1909 and had already proven himself in the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916 under General John "Black Jack" Pershing. Eisenhower, 5 years younger and born in Denison, Texas, on October 14, 1890, had risen more quietly but no less brilliantly through the ranks. The two men admired each other genuinely, but they were fundamentally different temperaments. Patton was fire, instinct, and spectacle. Eisenhower was calculation, diplomacy, and political intelligence. During the North Africa campaign of 1942 and 1943, when American forces suffered humiliating defeats at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, it was Patton that Eisenhower called upon to revitalize the demoralized II Corps. Patton arrived, imposed iron discipline within days, and transformed a broken force into a fighting unit. The pattern was established early. When the situation was dire enough, Eisenhower always came back to Patton, even knowing the cost that came with him. That cost became spectacularly evident in August 1943 during the Sicily campaign, when Patton slapped 2 soldiers he believed were shirking their duties at field hospitals, men who were in fact suffering from what would today be recognized as combat stress injuries. The incidents, which occurred on August 3 and August 10, 1943, exploded into a massive public scandal after war correspondent Drew Pearson broadcast the story to millions of American listeners in November of that year. Public outrage was immediate and intense. Congressman Andrew May of Kentucky called for Patton's removal from command. Letters flooded the War Department and the White House. General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, demanded an explanation from Eisenhower. It was Eisenhower who had already personally confronted Patton, forcing him to apologize to the soldiers and to the units involved, and who had written Marshall a carefully crafted letter arguing that Patton's military value outweighed the gravity of his misconduct. Marshall accepted the explanation, but the political damage was done. Patton was sidelined while the planning for Operation Overlord proceeded without him in a meaningful command role. He spent months in a kind of professional purgatory, used as a decoy in Operation Fortitude to deceive the Germans into believing the D-Day invasion would target Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, a brilliant strategic deception that likely saved thousands of Allied lives but gave Patton none of the glory he craved and believed he deserved. Patton's redemption came roaring back in August 1944, when Eisenhower finally unleashed the Third Army in the breakout from Normandy that became one of the most spectacular advances in the history of mechanized warfare. From August 1 onward, Patton's forces swept across France at a speed that left German commanders paralyzed and unable to organize coherent defensive lines. Within weeks, the Third Army had liberated vast swaths of French territory, crossed the Seine, and was driving toward the German border. Patton famously ran short of fuel by early September 1944 as the Allied supply lines, stretched to their limits, forced Eisenhower to make painful prioritization decisions, and Patton believed, with great bitterness, that Eisenhower had favored Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's more cautious advance in the north over what Patton was convinced could have been a war-ending thrust into the heart of Germany. The argument between Patton and the Allied High Command over supply allocation was fierce, personal, and consequential. Patton wrote in his diary during this period that he was being strangled by politics and jealousy, that the war could be over by Christmas 1944 if only he were given the fuel and the freedom to move. History will never fully resolve whether he was right. What is certain is that by December 1944, when Hitler launched the massive Ardennes counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge on December 16, Patton's Third Army performed the most celebrated pivot in American military history, turning 90 degrees north in brutal winter conditions and driving relief forces into Bastogne to rescue the surrounded 101st Airborne Division by December 26, 1944. By the spring of 1945, as Germany collapsed and Allied armies crossed the Rhine, Patton was in his absolute element, driving deep into Central Europe, liberating concentration camps, including the horrifying scenes his soldiers encountered at Ohrdruf on April 4, 1945, where Patton was physically sickened by what he saw and forced his own officers and local German civilians to witness the atrocities, and pushing toward Czechoslovakia. But even in these final triumphant weeks, Patton was already looking beyond the war against Germany. He was looking east, toward the Soviet Union, and what he saw alarmed him deeply. Unlike many of his contemporaries who still hoped for a cooperative post-war relationship with Moscow, Patton was vocal, dangerously vocal, about his belief that the Western Allies should confront Soviet expansion immediately, while they still had the military advantage. He spoke openly, recklessly, in ways that horrified his superiors and delighted newspaper reporters looking for headlines. He suggested to journalists that the Russians were the next enemy. He compared members of the denazification program to Democrats and Republicans in a press conference on September 22, 1945, an analogy that caused international uproar and handed Soviet propaganda a gift. Eisenhower, under enormous pressure from Washington, from London, and from an American public exhausted by war, had no political choice remaining. On October 2, 1945, he relieved Patton of command of the Third Army and reassigned him to command the 15th Army, a historical study group with no combat role, a command that was, in every meaningful sense, a dignified burial of the career of America's greatest field general. We are now at the heart of this story, and if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, this is exactly the moment to do it, because what happened next, in the weeks between that reassignment and the end of Patton's life, involves private conversations, suppressed ambitions, and a behind-the-scenes intervention by Eisenhower himself that most casual students of history have never examined closely. Subscribe now, like this video to help the algorithm bring it to people who love real history, share it with someone who needs to understand how the greatest military minds of the 20th century navigated impossible political terrain, and leave a comment below telling us what you think. Could Patton have been brought back, and should he have been? The pressure on Eisenhower to act decisively against Patton had come directly from Harry S. Truman, who had assumed the presidency on April 12, 1945, following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and who had very little patience for military officers who conducted foreign policy from press conference podiums. Truman was attempting to navigate an extraordinarily delicate relationship with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union in the immediate post-war period, with negotiations over the occupation zones of Germany, the fate of Poland, and the structure of the United Nations all hanging in precarious balance. Patton's loose remarks about fighting the Russians were not merely embarrassing, they were potentially destabilizing to American foreign policy at its most vulnerable moment. Truman made his displeasure clear to Eisenhower through Secretary of War Henry Stimson and through the chain of command, and Eisenhower, who was already being positioned as a future political figure of enormous consequence, understood that protecting Patton any further would damage not just Patton but himself and the entire military establishment. Yet even as he made the decision to relieve Patton, Eisenhower was simultaneously considering whether a path existed to rehabilitate his old friend in some future capacity. Private correspondence and later memoirs reveal that Eisenhower genuinely believed Patton's military genius remained valuable and that in a different political climate, in a different strategic environment, Patton could still serve the nation in a meaningful role. The question was whether that moment would ever come, and time was running out. Following his reassignment in October 1945, Patton spiraled into a private depression that those close to him found alarming. He wrote letters to his wife, Beatrice Eyre Patton, expressing his belief that his career was finished, that he had been destroyed not by the enemy but by the pettiness of politics and the cowardice of men who would never have had careers without soldiers like him to win their wars. He spoke privately to his aide, Major General Hobart Gay, about retirement, about writing his memoirs, about returning to his family estate in Massachusetts. Yet even in these darkest personal weeks, military observers and senior commanders continued to argue, in private channels, that Patton was irreplaceable. General Omar Bradley, who had commanded the 12th Army Group and who had a famously complicated relationship with Patton, respecting his battlefield genius while finding his personality exhausting and politically toxic, later wrote that Patton was the most effective battlefield commander the United States Army produced in the Second World War, a judgment that carried enormous weight. Eisenhower, reflecting on the period in his own memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, was careful to balance his admiration for Patton's gifts with an honest accounting of the cost those gifts imposed on everyone around him. The picture that emerges from these private accounts is of a supreme military talent being slowly suffocated by the new reality of post-war politics, a reality that Patton himself refused, or perhaps was constitutionally unable, to accept. The moment that rendered all questions about Patton's future irrelevant came on December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany, when the staff car carrying Patton collided with an army truck. The accident, which occurred on a road outside the city as Patton was traveling to a pheasant hunt, left everyone else in the vehicle essentially unharmed but sent Patton crashing forward with devastating force, fracturing his third cervical vertebra and leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. He was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where the finest military surgeons available worked to stabilize him. Beatrice Patton flew immediately from the United States to be at his bedside. For 12 days, Patton lingered, sometimes lucid, sometimes drifting, speaking to his wife and to the doctors and nurses around him about his life, his regrets, his pride in his soldiers. Eisenhower visited him in the hospital during those final days, a visit that by all accounts was emotionally devastating for both men, two old soldiers confronting together the strange and brutal way that history had chosen to end one of their stories. On December 21, 1945, at 1745, General George S. Patton Jr. died of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, complications from his injuries. He was 60 years old. He was buried, at his own request, alongside his soldiers in the American Military Cemetery at Hamm, Luxembourg, among the men of the Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge, the battle that many believed was his greatest hour. Eisenhower attended no public ceremony, but those who knew him said he never fully made peace with how the final chapter of Patton's life had unfolded, and whether a different decision, made earlier or later, might have written a different ending. The argument Patton had made about Soviet intentions, so controversial in 1945, would be validated within 3 years by the Berlin blockade, the fall of China, and the opening salvos of the Cold War. History, as it so often does, waited long enough for the man who had seen it coming to no longer be alive to say, "He told them so." If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know before, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video to help it reach the history lovers who need to see it, share it with someone in your life who respects the real and complicated human stories behind the headlines of the past, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most, because these stories deserve to be heard, and it is people like you who make sure they are never forgotten.